In this lesson, we will see how we can create camera depth of field effect for our interiors. But before that, we will try to create a simple exercise so we can understand the basics and see how that effect applies to our scene. First of all, the effect of depth of field is linked to our aperture or our f number. You can see a representation of this action on these two images. If our aperture is wide open, in this case we got a narrow depth of field or a narrow focus area. Keep in mind we will have to control the focus point. This is controlled by camera target in 3ds Max, I'll show that in a second. And vice versa, if we aim to obtain a large area of focus or a large depth of field, we will have to stick to a small aperture. So basically the aperture or the f number controls the amount of focus or the depth of field that we are getting in our camera. Let's get back to our previous scene. You can see that our very physical camera got a target. This is the focus point that we will establish, and the space between these two big planes controls actually the focus area. So in other words, we can say that before and after these two big planes, the image will start to lose focus or decrease in focus. And the area between these two big planes, it's actually the area where we got our focus or where we are interested in. So we said that with the f number or our aperture, we can control this area. First of all, let's get to max and let's see how that f number affects our scene. First of all, if I'll start to move or increase or decrease our f number, you can see that the planes begin to move. In that way, we can control or adjust visually the area of our focus, but we also have to keep in mind that changing the f number, we are starting to change the exposure of our image. So first of all, let's start our render and let's see what's going on in our render so we can adjust that visually. You can see if I'm starting to decrease the f number, my focus area becomes narrow, but also our aperture gets wider, more light is coming in, and thus our image becomes brighter. And that process goes vice versa. So first of all, let's try to find a way to adjust the exposure of our image. If we want to see clear the effect of depth of field, first of all, we will have to create a few copies of our objects. By creating those objects, we will be able to see on a real distance the increasing or decreasing effect of our camera depth of field. The next step will be to install the target of our camera. That's why we usually use targeted cameras. The target of our camera controls the center of our focus. That's why first of all we install the focus or this target on the object or the objects or area that we are interested in. You can see even on these images as example that the focus area is actually controlled by the camera target. Let's say for example in this case I'm interested to see the first object in focus and the rest of the objects will decrease in focus. So first of all we will install the camera target on the first object. There will be our main focus. And the second step will be to adjust our camera so we can obtain a pleasant view to reveal the decreasing focus of our objects. Next, we will get to the third step. We will have to adjust the exposure. Changing the f number also changes the exposure of our camera. That's why it's a lot easier to switch from physical to exposure value. And in that way, it will be a lot more easier to control the exposure of our image using only one number, this value number. First of all, our previous Vray light, it's not enough now to see the whole scene, so I'll switch to a dome light. And also let's decrease the multiplier so we can adjust the light to a normal or a medium exposure. Anyway, we will have to readjust a bit our exposure, so let's install for example 10 for this dome light. Next we will have to adjust, or should I say to fine adjust the view of our camera. And in order to enable the effect of depth of field for our camera, we will have to go to camera settings, find the depth of field, and we will enable that effect. You can also see in this panel not only the depth of field, you can see the motion blur as well. But as interior designers, we are not creating animation. That's why we will not use motion blur. We are creating only static views. That's why from this rollout we usually choose only the depth of field effect. So one more time, let's get back to our f number settings. When we lower this f number, first of all more light comes in, our aperture opens, and the depth of field is seen more clearly. If I'll try to set the f number to 1, for example, you can see clearly the effect. The target of our camera or the focus area is set on the first object. That's why the first object is in focus, and the narrow area of focus is controlled by the f number like you see on this image. Now let's try to reverse our effect. I'll set the f number to 22 like you see on the image. In this case our aperture is very narrow, less light come in, and the depth of field is very wide. In a way we can say that we are not seeing the effect, although the effect is present. You can see that the big planes start to increase distance between them, thus increasing the area of focus. By the way, if you remember from the previous lessons, we got the feature of focus distance. We can enable this feature and control the focus of our camera if we don't want to move our camera. But usually we are using the target of our camera. First of all, it's a lot easier. Second, it's a lot easier visually to see the focus area. You can select the camera target using right click. It's a lot easier to get to it when we got a lot of objects in our scene. So by selecting and moving the target of our camera, we can adjust our focus area. Next, let's try to adjust a bit our camera. Let's get closer to our objects. Also, let's try to adjust a bit the position of our camera or our view. Let's hit render and let's try to understand how we can adjust the whole image or the exposure of our image using the depth of field and the exposure at the same time. In this case, we got only one light, but when we got interior scenes with a lot of lights, it's a lot easier to adjust the exposure itself. That's why first of all we adjust the hierarchy of all our lights inside our scene, and next we go to exposure value. And using this number we start to adjust the pleasant exposure for our image, and in this way we obtain a correctly exposed image and a depth of field effect for our camera. Now the next logical question would be, how do we apply all that in our interior scenes? Let's try to open our previous scene and let's try to create a very physical camera so we can understand the whole process. First of all, from the top we select an area where we want to set our focus. One more important thing, in front of our camera, in front of our focus area, we must have a few objects so we can see clearly the effect of depth of field. In this case, I will try to set our focus on the floor lamp. Although if we talk about interior rules, this type of frame, this type of ratio for our frame does not match a good design. I will not change the frame and the ratio now so we can see the ceiling and the floor at the same time. Don't forget to enable depth of field, of course. In this example, we will stick only to the effect itself. So we will change also to exposure value, and next we will change our F number so we can obtain that narrow effect of our depth of field. So one more time, changing the F number and obtaining this narrow effect of depth of field. Usually people stick only to this effect. Changes the exposure of our whole image. That's why we will get to this exposure value and we will have to adjust the exposure of our whole image. You'll have to adjust that visually, of course. In this case, I will stick to this number. I'll start the render, then I'll pause the video and I'll show you the final render. Well, this is not a final render, of course. It took about 5 minutes to render. But now you can see clearly the effect of depth of field created by the Vray physical camera.